Hello and welcome. My name is Joe O'Mara. I am the Head of Aviation Finance with KPMG. And on behalf of KPMG and Airline Economics, I'm delighted to be joined by Betsy Snyder. Betsy will be well known, I'd say, to most of our watchers. She is a director with S&P. Betsy, before we get into maybe the meat of the conversation, do you want to tell our watchers a little bit about your role in S&P and what you cover from an aviation perspective?
Sure. Good to see you again, Joe. I am on the corporate side, so I'm involved with rating airline and aircraft lessor debt. I'm the primary analyst for the aircraft lessors globally. And I also work closely with our structured finance people on their aircraft ABS transactions, although there hasn't been much of that this year.
We might touch on that shortly.
So I'm involved with all facets of aviation at S&P.
And maybe to ask you first around the macro environment, and I should say we're recording this in New York at the end of October. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that macro environment has evolved over the course of this year, right? So we are very conscious of just the huge levels of uncertainty that are there, whether that's interest rate, oil prices, inflation, currency. Can you talk to us over just the challenges in assessing kind of risk and performance with that level of uncertainty that's out there?
Yeah, I mean, especially for somebody, I've been doing this for many years, and I've been amazed at the level of airline travel that we've seen over the last, maybe not, I fully expected it through the summer because there was a lot of pent-up demand. A lot of people hadn't traveled for a long time. Some of the, with the strength of the dollar, people were traveling outside of the US. So I fully expected that through the end of the summer. But I've been very surprised at how strong it has been since then, and what all the airlines, or at least the US airlines, and I guess some of the European airlines are saying too, about the strength, the ongoing strength, especially in Europe with the Ukraine situation, higher energy prices, inflation, higher interest rates, but yet we're not really seeing the slowdown. And I'm wondering if there's been a lot of trends that have happened, that are happening, that people cite. When you have more people working remotely, they have more flexibility to travel, to combine business and leisure. And I'm wondering if this is something, a trend of the future, a new way of thinking about airline travel going forward. I think we need to see more evidence of this, but if that's the case, then we have to start looking at it this way.
And that point's potentially a very positive trend and interesting to think about. When you look at the more challenging aspects that are out there at the moment, you touched on the sorry situation in Ukraine with the Russian invasion. Can you talk to us a little bit about the impact that has had since probably the end of Q1 this year? And is that impact, ignoring maybe the knock-on piece it's had on inflation, starting to dissipate on aviation finance, or is it still a cloud that hangs over it?
I think the biggest cloud over aviation finance these days is the higher interest rates and the higher cost of capital, which is probably a knock-on effect from the trends that you mentioned. But I don't think that those trends are the drivers of what we're seeing now. I think it's more just the higher cost of capital and the big increase that happened very quickly. I mean, you've had higher fuel costs, higher labor costs, and more to come on this. But the airlines have been able to pass these on in terms of higher fares, and the passengers don't seem to be balking at these higher fares, which is something else that I'm finding very unusual this time around. That passengers, the demand is there. I'm sure part of it is the fact that the airlines have had to reduce capacity because of some of the shortfalls we've talked about. the pilot shortage, the shortage at some of the airports, that labor, there's not enough labor to handle all the passengers. And you look at some of the airports in Europe where they've had to cut back on the flights there because there's just not enough labor to handle the flights. So I think that shortages are a positive for the space, because otherwise the airlines, well, the other thing driving this is the OEM capacity and the delays in the deliveries of aircraft. So between the delays, having fewer aircraft than they thought they would have, having the labor shortages, the airlines are being forced to cut their capacity. And so that's been a positive for the airline industry as well as the aircraft lessors, because they have a shortage of aircraft themselves. They're also subject to these OEM delays. They haven't gotten as many aircraft as they thought they would get delivered. And so that's been helping them in terms of demand, as well as demand for some of the older aircraft and lease extensions and whatever.
Yeah, and maybe moving with that around the leasing piece, we've seen, the leasing threshold breach 50%, and when you're assessing and looking at lessors, do you view that as something that is probably a long-term and sustainable trend, or will we end up in a situation there, if airline performance improves and balance sheets improve, that we'll see it kind of return back to that kind of mid-high 40s level, or do you think we've seen a sustainable step change?
I think it's sustainable. I think that there's still a few more points that they can get. Some of the airlines are certainly benefiting from, they could benefit in the future, and then maybe there'd be less demand for leasing aircraft. But when you look at the order books of the lessors and their ability to finance these, I think that some of the weaker airlines, they really have no other options where to go to get aircraft. And so I think that's going to be a major driver of demand for leased aircraft, is because of the deliveries or the order books that the lessors have, that's going to help drive their market share. And I think that maybe it could go to the mid to high 50s over the next few years, nothing imminent. But I think there's still room for them to increase their market share.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that if you look at the long-term trend, it does go one way. It ticks upwards, and we've probably seen an acceleration in that uptick. And I'm probably with you, right, on that being a sustainable change. When you look at the leasing market and you're assessing it, is there an importance on scale, right? So we now have probably AerCap stands alone as a supersized lessor. We've maybe 6 to 8 players in the IG space, and then you have the rest, right? And would you sense that when you look at the rest, right, that's a challenging market to be in?
I agree with you. I think that the large investment grade lessors are the ones that are in a better position. I think they have access to capital. Maybe they don't have access to the capital markets, but at some point they will go back to the capital markets. If you look at what happened when COVID started and AerCap went back to the capital markets, they had a successful transaction, and it was very high cost, but it opened up the door for others. Now, I think that you'll probably see some consolidation of some of the smaller participants. And I think that they will have, although there are, I've been hearing at the conferences, there is access to capital in terms of, from the banks. And the banks are anxious to get into this space again, because with the capital markets being so strong in 20 and 21, they were kind of shut out. So they want to get back in again, but the banks only have so much capital. And so I think you will see some consolidation among some of the smaller ones.
Can I ask you on that, just what constitutes small now, right? Because if you kind of look what's happened, and you say that the consolidations that's happened over the course this year is imminently about to happen, it's in that 100 to 150 aircraft kind of lessor. which we never used to call small, but maybe that's what small is now. Just your thoughts
Well,
around that.
yeah, I mean, you look at the Carlisle bought Fly last year, AMCK. You have SMBC in the process of buying Gus Hawk, which is still a few hundred aircraft, but it's going to make them the second largest after AerCap. And so I agree with you. It used to be only a few, maybe 100 aircraft was a good size. But I think, probably bigger is better these days.
And you referenced the capital markets a couple of times, and as you say, that AerCap transaction in kind of mid-20 kind of just reopened it. And I guess we saw lessors fill their boots effectively, right, over the course of 21.
Yes.
even parking the AerCap GCAS raise, huge levels of raising at exceptional rates, which has bought them a lot of headroom, but they're going to have to go back. When is your expectation is when we will see the IG-rated lessors return in a more challenged interest rate environment?
Good question. That's what we've all been wondering. I mean, AerCap has said publicly that they don't have to go back this year, not till next year. Avalon on their earnings call yesterday said they have enough liquidity. They don't have to go back for a while. Those are the only two that have said anything publicly. It's my thinking that it's going to have to be AerCap or Air Lease that go first. And so far, neither of them have indicated when they plan to go, but they benefited from the fact that their CapEx is way below what anyone expected and their need for debt because of the fact that, these delivery delays. But at some point, these delays are going to ramp up. Capital spending is going to increase. So I think somebody's going to have to do something in 2023.
Yeah, because it feels like we're just at a bit of a clog in the market, right?
Yeah,
so we're at that situation where, as you say, slow on delays, which means the big guys aren't packaging portfolios, aren't putting them out, and then we just have a challenged trading environment. And despite the fact, as you say, the traditional aviation banks seem to have the capital and are there, something's got to give, and it kind of when it gives, right?
Definitely. And when you think about it, because the capital markets were so liquid in 20 and 21, that the average cost of capital for most of the large lessors is still pretty low. So even if they had to refinance something, it's not going to have a substantial impact on their overall cost of debt in their capital structure for a while. I mean, look at AerCap. They raised $23 billion last year to finance GCAS. They really hit the market right. They were lucky they did that last year, because if that had happened this year, it would have been a whole other situation.
Yeah, entirely right. And the other portion of the capital markets, which you referenced earlier, was ABS, right? So we saw that market rebound with nearly surprising speed in 21. We knew at the start of this year there were a lot of deals in the pipe. And sentiment-driven market, we have Russia, and now we have rates. What's your take on where that market currently sits? We obviously had the Carlisle transaction earlier in the year, and now we're just at an impasse.
From what I understand, the transactions that were put on hold, they have warehouse facilities in place, and so they're kind of biding their time until they see what happens. But I think that Robert Korn made an interesting presentation this morning. I don't know if you saw it, but when he said basically they're back at where they were in 2014. So I think everyone just got so spoiled by these low rates, but they don't recall the days prior to that when pricing was much higher. So we'll be in a round trip back to where we were 8 years ago. And presumably to get there or to unclog that market, the challenge we have is lease rate factors, right? So we are seeing, and I guess the question is, would you agree, we're seeing an uptick, but it's just not correlating with the acceleration in interest rates. Exactly. I think I think on new deliveries, it's okay, but it's on the existing lease rates, because because the lag is just not, it happens so quickly, so the question is, how long is the lag going to be before they can reprice these? As aircraft come off lease and they're renewed or extended, then they have that opportunity. But if they signed leases, within the last year or two, it's going to be a while.
Yeah, and I guess that's a challenge if you'd packaged a portfolio and you're ready to go. And your warehouse will get you, 12 months, 24 months, but then something's got to give. Yeah. You referenced the aviation banks are back in the market. Just what are the other options, right? So you obviously have some of the non-traditional lending platforms that have come over the last couple of years. Just your thoughts, if ABS isn't there, what will step into the breach?
Well, I've heard several comments today about the private credit markets. And I'm intrigued by that, about finding out more about that, about them stepping in. And I guess some of them are owned by the private equities and they have a lot of cash available. And I don't know if private equity, not private equity, the private credit markets are just going to step in for now, and they serve the purpose of maybe a warehouse facility, and then hope to take it out at some point in the future. But I think that's an interesting alternative that we haven't had that before.
I think seeing how that develops over the next kind of 6 months or so will be interesting.
Yes.
If you posit that ABS is probably Q2 next year, maybe, right? At best. Can I ask you then, from an asset class perspective, we talked about the uncertainty that's there for aviation, but kind of uncertainty is there for everyone, right? That interest rate environment affects everyone. The inflation environment affects everyone. Aircraft as an asset class, we've seen an awful lot of sophistication in relation to it over the last decade or so. The capital markets unsecured piece speaks to that. How do you think aircraft as an asset class stacks up in this highly uncertain environment?
Well, I think it's tainted by a few things. I think it's tainted by COVID and the lease restructurings that happened during COVID. I think it's tainted by the Russia situation, which, by the way, is a positive for the sector because you have over 400 aircraft that are stranded in Russia that are out of the global fleet. So in an environment where you have strong demand and you don't have the capacity, there's over 400 fewer aircraft there. So I think that those...
So as long as you don't own the aircraft that are over there, right?
Well, you're the one who was responsible for all the impairment charges. But I think, and by the way, we looked at these impairment charges. We did a review of everything, and we still affirmed the ratings despite the impairment charges, because the other things we thought mitigated those impairment charges, and we saw that the strong demand and the less debt coming in because less need for capital spending and debt, that offset it somewhat. So we actually affirmed everything despite those huge impairment charges that the lessors were forced to take.
And in theory, they're into contingent upside now, right? So we'll see where that insurance market will go. That's a medium-term play, right?
And we're not even factoring any insurance recoveries into our ratings because it's such a unknown. When and how much.
Agreed. And can I ask you then, just shifting gears a little bit on ESG with a particular focus on the E, right? So a lot more chat in the space over the last couple of years around it, understandably so. As we exit a crisis of COVID into certain other crises, it will continue to increase in importance. When you are assessing from a credit rating perspective, how much of an ESG lens are you applying to your assessments?
Well, we have something that we instituted last year called ESG credit indicators. They actually represent something that we've already incorporated in our ratings anyway. So there's nothing new here. It's just that we kind of came up with a scale from, and so now we assign a scale of 1 to 5 on each of our on each of the E, S, and G. For the lessors, they're pretty much all 2s, which is pretty much neutral.
And is that just speaking to the technology that they own typically?
It's yes. One of the other things that drives, well, the E is pretty much 2 for everybody. The S, for the airlines, the S, which is the social part of it, actually incorporates health and safety. So when COVID hit and nobody was flying and their passenger levels were down and earnings and cash flow were hit, we pretty much went to an S4 for all of the airlines. And then they've since, as business has improved, they've since come down to an S3. On the G, which is governance, one of the factors that's incorporated in that is who the owners are. And for airlines and aircraft lessors that are owned by private equity, they would tend to have a G3 rating. But for the other airlines and lessors, they would be a G2. So for the aircraft lessor, for most of the aircraft lessors that we rate, they're all 2s, which is neutral, which is, it's not a material factor in our rating.
And then that was my question, right? So you rate them in a certain way, they come out a score. How impactful is that yet, or is it that impactful on how you're rating them?
No, because part of, especially the airlines or the lessors that have large order books, we view that as a positive already in our rating, because we think that they're going to benefit from strong demand because they have access to new technology aircraft, and they will be, so there'll be strong demand for these aircraft going forward, which is what we talked about before, how we think that the market share of the lessors could go higher than the 50% it is now.
So in doing the assessment that you do on lessors, presumably it's predominantly then, or it's an airline credit focus and an asset focus. When you're looking on the asset side, how much of a negative is it if you're not in narrow body new tech?
It's not. I'd have to go back and look at those that tend to have older fleets, but I think that it's so I have to go back and check. Because I know that most of them are E2s, but we might have 1 or 2 that are not E2s, but I don't recall offhand. It might be some of the ones that some of the regional lessors because some of the regionals have been under more pressure, but I'd have to go back and look. I don't recall offhand.
And then the wider assessment from an airline credit perspective, your thoughts then when you're assessing a lessor and you're considering the rating to apply to them, how deep are you going into the lessee profile and the challenges that might come with various airlines in their fleet?
Well, that's certainly something that we look at. The customer concentration, geographic diversity, types of fleet, that's all part of the analysis that we look at on the business risk profile. And most of the lessors have, certainly the larger ones, have satisfactory business risk profiles. There are a few of the smaller ones that we assess as fair.
Has Russia impacted your thoughts on that at all? So are you considering geopolitical risk in a slightly different way? So you hear chat around, oh geez, is China next, or those challenges that might be there?
No, what I can say is Russia didn't account for that big of a percentage of most aircraft lessors' portfolios. So that's not a negative. We've been looking at, there's a few things we've been looking at. Are there other parts of the world that maybe we should be focusing on if that's not such a good place to be in, that there might be problems going forward? One of the places we're looking at is China. And what we're seeing is that a lot of the lessors are reducing their exposure to China and maybe leaving it more to the Chinese lessors. That we do rate some Chinese lessors, but we rate them under, they're pretty much core to the bank, like ICBC, and so it's a different type of analysis than we do for the Western lessors or the standalone. So that's what I'm seeing, that some of them are reducing their exposure to the Chinese airlines, and maybe, when they have the opportunity to place the aircraft outside of China. So those are I think the Latin American airlines came through this pretty well. Despite the bankruptcies that were there, but still, they came through this okay. So it's not really a problem like the Russia-Ukraine situation is. I think the Russia, and I think what you're going to find is maybe certain jurisdictions will ask for bigger security deposits, maintenance reserves, letters of credit, things like that, to cover any potential situations. And I also think the insurance companies are probably going to be more stringent too in the policies that they write.
If you talk to a lessor who's tried to renew their insurance since April, I think it's both expensive and very challenging.
Yes.
Just in closing, Betsy, we talked about obviously an uncertain market with lots of challenges that's in a state of flux at the moment. Looking out over the next kind of 12 months or so, can I ask you, what are your hopes and what are your expectations for what's going to happen across aviation finance?
For everything, airlines, lessors,
maybe focusing
everything.
On the lessor side.
My expectations are that the lessors will have to go back to the capital markets next year. They have a lot of refinancing that's coming up. This was a pretty light year for them because they did so much prior to this. So that's my expectation regarding the lessors. They're going to have to go back to the capital markets in some form. My hope is that they're able to get some transactions done at not exorbitant pricing, and they're able to pass along these higher rates in terms of leases.
So a positive spot maybe coming out of COVID has been the resurgence of cargo, which has always been kind of a spiky market. Some would be saying now there's been a real step change. Your thoughts on whether that's a real growth and opportunity section?
Well, I like the way you said spiky, because we've always viewed it as more cyclical than passenger, the passenger side. Now, I have to say, I've been a skeptic. Every single air cargo company we've ever rated up until just a few years ago has always gone bankrupt. There's always been some problem. And because they've grown capacity too much. Now, I think that the cargo space has really benefited from the run-up in demand for goods, the shipping situation, the port situation, and so, and also the problems in China in shipping things out. But now, it seems to me there's going to be too much cargo capacity coming into this space. Everybody is converting passenger aircraft into cargo aircraft. Belly capacity is coming back, certainly as traffic to Asia Pacific opens up, more wide-body aircraft coming back into this space. So you have that. You have a lot of big aircraft coming back into this space. 747s, 777s from the freight delivered as freighters, not converted but delivered as freighters. So I personally think that it's benefited from e-commerce. I think e-commerce is still going to continue to grow, but not at the levels we've seen. So I am a skeptic on what we are going to see in air cargo going forward. I think there's going to be too much capacity coming into this market.
So not a genuine step change. We're probably still into a cyclical piece.
Still spiky, as you said.
Betsy, I'd like to thank you as always for your insights and wish you and S&P a very successful 2023.
For all of us. Thank you, Joe.